episode 4, as I purposely develop themes and ideas and repeat them. It's very, very clear in the two trilogies that I'm putting the characters in pretty much the same situations, sometimes even using the same dialogue, so that the father and the son go through pretty much the same experience. Obviously, and than his son takes. So that at some of these turning points they go the other way, but it's been set up for you to almost expect that they will go, that Luke will follow in his father's footsteps, because in a lot of these episodes they do follow each other, which leads to a subtle influence which gives the audience a little expectation. And say it's a musical idea. You have a lyrical refrain and you keep playing it over and over again in different, using different instrumentation, different octaves. It changes every time you rehear it. It's the same note played differently. I've tried to use that right from the very beginning. When I did Star Wars, I was doing that. It really came out from something I was trying to do in THX, my first film I ever did, which was, instead of 3 acts, there's almost like 3 different movies, but each movie is telling the same story in a different way. I became fascinated with that idea of, it's kind of visual jazz. It's like you go off on a riff on the same idea, and you just take the concept and you just interpret it differently visually. And there's a lot of that going on in these movies. I like the idea of cyclical motifs that keep recurring over and over and over again.
This was the very last sequence we shot in Tunisia on the very last day before we returned back for another 8 weeks of shooting at Leavesden. It was a very bittersweet day, very hot, but also a very emotional scene.
And the position here when he leaves his mother is not that much different from when Obi-Wan asks him to come along with him on his adventure. And he decides he can't do it because he has all these obligations and he doesn't want to leave his home. And even though he's very anxious to leave, from the first part of the movie, it's the same kind of conflict. In this one, he takes the road. In the one with Luke, he decides not to take the road, but the inevitability of events force him to take the road. It's sort of like fate. And it would be the same thing here. But in this case, he didn't wait for fate to push him into this. He took the road. First, get a confrontation between a Jedi and a Sith. I wanted to be very abstract, not deal with it, because we have to. The end of the movie, the climax of the movie, is the confrontation of these two characters. So I didn't want to give it away at this point. So I did it with a lot of swirling robes and flashing swords and kicking up a lot of dust, but not actually seeing the fight. This is really a little teaser of what we obviously are going to have at the end of the movie.
Initially, the fight was designed to have a lot of flying in it. Essentially flying swordsmen. But along the way, that idea just didn't develop very well. And there was also a fight on the ramp of the spaceship as it took off over the desert. Qui-Gon jumped up to the ramp and was followed by Darth Maul. They actually fought a bit on the ramp before Qui-Gon cut the ramp, dropping Darth Maul to the desert below.
This is a little scene I toyed with over and over again, which is the introduction of Anakin to Obi-Wan. Obviously a very important moment, but I didn't want to overplay it, and I had this initial skepticism on Obi-Wan's part. Obi-Wan is not a big fan of Anakin's in this movie. That doesn't happen until later on.
One of the devices designed for Star Wars was the walking chair. This was done with the guy actually pushing it, and we had to remove all the mechanism underneath and replace this with the full computer graphic chair that was animated after the fact.
Including the marble floor. I remember you guys having to paint that, and
right.
I still can't imagine how difficult that would have been.
Yeah, all the patterns, you notice most of the floors are actually shiny as well, which meant that we had to reproduce not only the texture of the floor, but also the reflections and shadows. It's an extremely difficult shot, the actual panning over to see Jar Jar sleeping at the table, because the wide-angle anamorphic lenses cause so much distortion that if we put him on the plate in the background scene, then his feet would slide relative to his body, because everything was distorting. So this was one of the first challenges that we had to do, where we actually had to distort the computer graphics to match the distortion in the original play. The shots where we only see his feet are actually just
Ahmed in the suit.
Ahmed in the suit.
Those are not computer generated.
And even these scenes with the Queen and the young boy had to be done with a certain amount of splits, because once again George wanted to change some of the timings or actual positions and things. So there's a couple in here where we had to do some manipulation after the fact.
There are two characters who are both off on a very difficult journey, both feeling very alone and each other. Padme gets comfort from comforting Anakin, but it also gives her a chance to reflect a little bit on the problems she's having in terms of making decisions about what she's going to do about this situation of her people suffering. Her only hope at this point in the movie is to go to Coruscant, go to the Senate, and hope that justice will be done and her people will be freed. But I think underneath that, I've been trying to set up the fact that she's skeptical about whether this is all going to really work. I mean, she has to believe it because it's the only choice she has.
A planet completely covered by city. This was a really fun project to work on here. I'm trying to think, it's completely covered in buildings from orbit, but have that not look like the Death Star.
One of the elements of the landing Queen starship, which sound like backfiring of the engine, is in reality the cracking of the Hubbard Glacier near Yakutat, Alaska.
The time we come to Coruscant, I was never able to do it before. I did it sort of in little bits and pieces, but I was never able to actually show the real city because it would have been too costly and too difficult. You know, when you're making a movie where the central action is happening on some capital planet, but you never get to go there, you only hear about it, is not a fun way to tell a story. But this way I could go right into the middle of it and see this whole aspect of the Republic, which is very crucial to the whole story because that's what it's about, is the Emperor coming to take over, and how did a democracy turn into a dictatorship. One of our main characters, Anakin, is a little boy from Tatooine who has never been off-world, so to speak. And so I really wanted to tell this particular scene from the point of view of Anakin about the wonder of being in this amazing environment with all these very important people that he doesn't really understand what they're talking about or what's going on. And his only friend really is Padme. So he's using her as his anchor. There's conversations going on that are sort of above his head that we don't really know what they're talking about. A very elaborate environment, very different from Tatooine. And I wanted to really get the wonder of the Republic and the government and the giant city from Anakin's point of view, because I thought that would be the most interesting way to reveal this particular environment, which is, I guess in the end, probably one of the more glorious and impossible to do if you don't have digital technology. We also decided to add on, before we had this scene where we got to see a little bit of the planet in the taxi, and in an effort to shorten the movie, we pulled it out and put it back in again, because it does give a chance to see a little bit of the environment, a little bit of the city that, a planet that is a complete city, and show it off a little bit, wonder of it all. I very purposely kept Anakin sort of on the sidelines. The Gungan and the boy are always kind of, outside in the hallway somewhere. But that is the way it would be. They wouldn't be included in these kinds of meetings. They're kind of puzzled by what's going on. They're standing on the sidelines. It's a little bit a riff on the very first film, where the story is told through the point of view of the droids, who were sort of the lowliest characters. In this one, I'm doing it through primarily the two Jedi, but then the secondary characters are also carrying a lot of the weight when the Jedi aren't around, which is basically Jar Jar and Anakin. Because the central story is ultimately the Queen's dilemma and the Queen's problem of the threat to her planet and her people, and how is she going to save them.
Second thing we shot on the second day of principal photography.
On the day of the window, of course, it had just been blue screen. The actors were told where they were, of course, in the script, and where they were on what planet, but I don't think they had any idea of the expanse that was going to be outside the windows. I know from speaking to them after we saw the premiere, they were blown away by just shots like this. They just go by, and the audience probably doesn't even think about them being effect shots, because we've now seen the city from so many different angles, but they're still remarkable when you look at them.
Palace shot, the big establishing shot, was done shooting some models of the actual towers, and then the rest was done as a digital matte painting. So they photographed the set, and then George decided later that the windows that they built with blue screen behind them were too high. So we ended up lowering the windows. That meant tracing every character who's against a window, rotoscoping them, and cutting that section out. George also wanted to make this look as real as possible in terms of photography, so we actually overexposed the background as if you're exposing for the interior.